Hello and welcome to part 14 of my Undertale and Deltarune Fangame tutorial series. Today's episode will go over learning the process of programming original code and ideas into our game. And I will show this by walking through my step-by-step process on how I make things using a shop system as an example. Make sure to follow this tutorial before the new dialogue videos, since some stuff in this video gets used in them. For those who want to know why exactly those videos had to be redone, I'll explain it in a video in the new part 10. Now, let's get started. Whenever I have an idea for something to create, the very first thing I do is break the idea into smaller pieces and consider which order is most logical to do everything. At this step, it's important to consider both the big and small scale implementation of everything in relation to the rest of the game. For example, without getting into the details of how everything small works, do you think it makes more sense for the shop itself to just be an overlay over our pre-existing rooms, or should we take the player to a room dedicated to the shop? In programming, there are usually multiple solutions to get something working, with some easier or more sensical than others, so I'll give you a second to weigh the benefits of each and which one you'd think would make the most sense in this case. You got it? While you could do either option in this case, I think it makes most sense to take the player into a new room that contains the shop. This way we don't have to worry about adding a screen fade or stopping the old music and starting the new music. We can just use the systems we already set up for that when moving between rooms. In the case of the smaller menu only used by shops like the spider bake sale, it makes sense to do it just as an overlay since you can still see everything beneath and there's no special graphics going on. This may seem basic and obvious, but it's always good to consider all your options before you start committing to something. Next, let's break it down further. Why do shops exist? To sell you items. Before we can have shops, we need to have items, and there are 4 types of items we need to implement. Those are weapons, armor, food, and other. The first 3 categories are self-evident, and other just means items that are used for non-battle purposes, such as being for a joke, or to solve a puzzle, or for story stuff. So think of the punch card, or Devil's Prison Key, or a shadow crystal. Okay, but how are we actually going to add these items? We need to store them in a way that we can easily access different items' names, shortened names, serious mode names, stats, shop, menu, and battle description. And not only that, but we need to potentially store different values for different characters. With like the T in chapter 2, for example, where there's different values for healing for like Noelle drinking CCT versus Chris drinking CCT. We also need to store any buffs such as a larger grazing area, which may exist for some items but not for others. Off the top of your head, it may be hard to think of how to do that, but in times like this, where we aren't sure exactly of an easier way to do what we want to do, or any way at all, we go to our best friend, the Gamemaker documentation. Just look up Gamemaker documentation and click GML code reference, and we can read all about the different capabilities of Gamemaker that we can take advantage of. In general, I'd recommend just skimming through different parts of it, just because there's a lot of useful stuff in here that you never know might be useful. And you're trying to do something like, oh, I kind of remember seeing that. So yeah. And in this case, why don't you take a few minutes to look through and find some possible features of Gamemaker that could be useful in this situation. There's no one answer, so don't stress if what you pick out isn't exactly how I end up doing things. Pause the video here to have time to look through the documentation yourself. Ready? Let's go through this together by following exactly how I found the solution that we're going to use. First, I clicked data structures because there might be a way to structure the data that would make things convenient for us. The first option that caught my attention was grids because mentally, I pictured something like this, where each item and each of its values can be laid out vertically, and we could access each value in the code as needed by calling for a specific row and column. The downside of that is that we need to have some way of remembering every item's row and column for each variable and that we need to access. If we were to use this approach, however, and we read the note on the previous page, it does say we should use an array instead since it's more beginner friendly. And we don't have to worry about garbage collection and stuff. If we click the array link and then click multi-dimensional arrays, it should show us that we have essentially the same thing but with a 2D array instead of a grid. While using a 2D array / grid could work, I wasn't too satisfied since it would mean that we would have to set a bunch of values for every item that wouldn't be necessary, and it might be confusing at times what row and column index correspond to what value. There was something else that caught my eye though. What was that it said there in the note? Something about structs? Let's go check what that is. I encourage you to read through this page to try and see how this could be useful to us. Pause now if you wish to do so. Done? Well, this is perfect for us for a few reasons. First and foremost, structs let us store one struct inside of another, which means we can have a global struct called items that we store all of our items inside with unique values for each. And the other reason is that they're so good is that we can access whatever information we need from them by simply adding a dot and narrowing down the search. For example, if we just have an item called Susie Candy and want to get how much it heals, in our code we can just say global.item.susie_candy.heals, and that will return exactly the value that we need. Which is very readable and easy to understand and to remember. Gamemaker will also give us a preview of all the possible values we can use when typing it out, which makes it even easier. We could also do something like global.item.susie_candy.heals_Noelle if that item has a value that heals Noelle more than other characters, which isn't necessarily a property of every item. We can also check on a per item basis what variables it has, since at the bottom here we can see it supports variable functions, which if we click on the link and look at variable instance exists, we can see it does exactly as it is called and can be used to only run code if a certain variable exists for something. As a note, if you want to find similar concepts to the page you're currently viewing, you can click the View Page in Context button and see it into relation to everything else in a nice list. Now, let's implement this all. First, in Gamemaker, let's create an object we'll use to set these values at the start of the game. I do plan on moving a lot of the game start code from our title object to this new one later in the series, since not everyone might be using a title in their main menu. First things first, let's make sure to place this object in our title room so that it actually runs. You can give it a sprite if you want, but just uncheck visible to be safe, and there's no need to make it persistent. If you haven't seen my last video, my Discord has voted to switch to this new code editor because there's more room and it's readable with a larger font size. This doesn't have any effect on functionality. It's the exact same thing, just visually represented differently, and you can still follow along the old way, but I'll show you how to get this if you'd like. First, click in the top left where it says File, then Preferences, then Code Editor 2, then check Enabled. Then go to Theme below it and set font size to 12 if you want it to be the same as me, or whatever you'd like. To apply changes, save and restart Gamemaker. Okay, now in our initializer object, let's add a game start event. So let's create the item struct by saying global.item equals and then our curly brackets with some space. Now we can create the structs for the individual items inside of it. You can create any item you wish, but I'll start with the food example. So before we even start with that, let's create structs for the 4 different item categories, starting with food. And now, this next part is very important. When creating structs within structs, we have to use a colon instead of an equal sign, otherwise you'll get an error. The same thing applies to creating variables within structs. You can have a space here in between the colon and the brackets if you want. Whether or not that makes sense to you is up to you. And now we can copy and paste this for the other 3 item types, making sure to add a comma after each one after the brackets, except for the last one, so the Gamemaker knows that they're different and that we don't get an error. In the food struct, let's just say here Susie_candy as our item name. The food struct will also be used for any type of consumables like tension bits and whatever else. Okay, and now the first variable should probably be the full item name displayed in menus and shops, which we can just call a name. Next, we can have the shortened name that Undertale uses when in battle, and that sometimes has a joke or pun to it, or is just silly in some other way. And again, make sure to add a comma after this, and on all variables except for the last one in the items struct. Next, we can have the shortened name Undertale uses for more serious battles. Don't feel obligated to shorten every single thing in some way. Not every item needs it, and also we don't have the battle system implemented yet for that to really matter at this stage. Anyway, we can add the item description in a variable called desk. Then we can add a variable called heals for how much it heals, how much HP it stores, and for this item I want it to heal Noelle extra because of her crush on Susie. So we can add heals_Noelle variable 2. Now for the next food item struct, we can just copy and paste it, the last one, making sure to add a comma, and now we can make all the changes we'd like. I'll turn this into Ralsei candy that doesn't heal Noel extra. And once you have that all done, feel free to add as many food items as you want with any special values you'd like to implement later. I won't show how to implement every possible effect that people may come up with, but in the battle tutorials I'll show a few common ones. And that applies to not just food items, but weapons and armors too. Now, onto weapons, we can copy and paste what we had for food and just adjust the values as needed, which all we need to do outside the name is change the heals variable to attack, which I will be shortening to AT. You don't need to worry about exact values for now since we don't have battle set up, but here's the formula used to calculate damage in Undertale and the formula used in Deltarune below it. And same thing with armor, but with defense, just replace heals with, I'm going to say DF for defense. And again, same thing with other /key items, replace DF with can_use, which is a true or false whether or not the player can use the item outside of battle to get a description on the item. And that only applies to in the light world. In the dark world, it just shows the description in the menu. Also remove the short and serious names since key items aren't in the battle menu. Now, to test that everything is working, we just need to create a step event and print a debug message in the Gamemaker output so that we'll know it's how we want it. Just type global.item.whatever category you want, be that food, weapon, whatever item you created, and whatever variable you want to test that we can access. It should show you a preview of all possible values as you type it, and if it doesn't, restarting should help. If you're getting an error, you're likely forgetting to use a colon or comma somewhere or add an extra comma where it doesn't belong. I will first run the game with a comma missing to show what that looks like. You should get something that looks like this. Search around the area that it mentions and look out for a missing comma and add it in. In this case, you can see it's saying line 17, so if you look around here, oh, here we go. This is where the comma's missing and we can add it back in. And if Gamemaker isn't highlighting exactly where you're having an error, you should be able to restart it, and that should hopefully fix it. And now that we know what it looks like when it goes wrong, we can run it correct this time. And there we go. Perfect. It shows exactly what we wanted. Now, just go through and check that it works for more than just one value to be certain it's working right. If it doesn't, read the error message and search around where it mentions for any possible mistakes. Oftentimes, you'll get errors for the smallest things that just slipped your mind when writing the code, and you mentally autocorrect it when reading it. So be sure to read what you wrote carefully and try to compare and contrast it with something similar that you know does work in your code, just small chunk by small chunk. And you can also just compare it with what you see in the video here. And we now have items implemented. But they aren't really actually useful if we can't have them in our inventory or in battles or shops or anything, which is why we're gonna add an inventory. I'll give you a minute now if you'd like to think of a way to store the player's items, and don't be afraid to look at the code reference that we looked at earlier if you need. You can pause here. Got it? Well, it's actually pretty simple. All we need to do is create a global array called inventory that stores our different items. We can worry about programming in all the logic of it later on, but for now, let's just add some items into test. All you gotta do is global.item.category, and then the name of the item that you want, and separate each item with commas. No need to specify one variable from the item struct. Just the struct for the item itself is what we want. All right, and perfect. Now, we can change our debug message to print out a specific inventory item we want. Remember that inventory slot numbers start at 0 and count up from there. Let's just start with 0 to make sure that the first slot works. Then, we just need to specify what variable we want to access, so let's go with name. For some items, it might not show up in the suggestions when accessing them from the inventory, so just choose something you know that item has and ignore what the suggestions tell you. Alright, and it works. Awesome. And now, just real quick before we start coding the menu screen, I made a mistake when writing the code that reads our save file. In our object's title, make sure that we're setting global.name to the actual name and not the start room. And now we can get started with the menu. If you'd like, take a moment to consider how to go about drawing the menu on the screen without worrying about how only to make it show up by pressing C for now. You can reference other aspects of our project so far if you need, and you may pause here. Got it? Well, it's okay if not, especially if you didn't watch the old dialogue videos while they're still up and haven't seen the new ones yet, assuming they're out as you're watching this. We can use the same thing we used for the save point menu, where we draw the box to specify dimensions with the draw stretched function. If you don't have the box already, it's easy to make. Just create a UI folder under sprites, and in it, we want to create a sprite called spr_simplebox. Set the sprite dimensions to 8x8, then click Edit Image. We just want to have a 4x4 square in the center and fill the rest in with white, black square in the center. And back in our workspace, set frame rate to 0 if you're like me and just wanna, and then expand the box where it says 9 slice, and make sure to check the activate box and put 3 in each box. Now's a good time to download the small font used by the menu called Crypt of Tomorrow. I'll have a Google Drive link to download it in the description. Extract the file and install the font. Now, save and restart Gamemaker so that you can load it. And now create a new font called fnt_small and set the font size to 6, turn off anti-aliasing and regenerate it. We also need to change our mono and sans fonts because as I was testing the new dialogue system, I found some inaccuracies in terms of spacing for some characters. So we're going to install the Greater Determination mono and sans fonts, and they should be in the same Google Drive link as the other font. Just install them as usual and make sure to save and restart Gamemaker so that it can recognize those fonts, and then change the fonts for both the font main and font main sans to the greater counterparts. Change the size to 9 and regenerate. It also wouldn't be a bad idea to click add range for your fonts, especially if you're using characters that aren't in the normal 26 letters of the Latin alphabet, because sometimes characters might be displayed as just a box because it's not one of the default characters Gamemaker checks for. So to fix that, just click add, from code, add range, and regenerate. Repeat this process for all fonts just to be safe, and remember to do this in the future in the case of a character not displaying right. Anyway, for the menu, we can create a menu object and add a create event and a draw event. Also, as a side note, for those who didn't see 13.5, you can move this navigation bar at the top. That's part of the new code editor if you wish. It's used for jumping into the different events and to add them. I'd like to have it at the side or at the top. Anyhow, inside of the draw event, we can add a draw stretched function to draw our menu box to the dimensions we desire. Just to test, let's say that we want to draw our simple box, and we have -1 for the frame, which just means they'll be on whatever frame the sprite is, which usually should animate it, but in this case, it's not gonna animate since our frame rate is 0, we only have 1 frame. Anyway, so then next, for the X and Y, for the top left of where the box will be drawn, we can just put 50 to test if it works, and finally for the length and width, we can just put 50 again to make sure they work. Alright, and now we can place this object in our title room just to make sure it's working. Okay, and we can see it does, but it's not the right size from the right spot. So we can close that out and try to figure out how to correct the numbers we want. For this, we can use any image editing software that we like and know how to use. But just since everyone watching this has access to Gamemaker, I'll use its image editor. Anyway, let's open our image program, and in the case of Gamemaker, create a sprite and call it whatever you want, and click Edit Image. Okay, and now we can open up Deltarune or Undertale and make sure it's not full screen. Okay, and now we need to get someplace where we can open the Undertale / Light World menu. And now we should click out of the window so that in the next step it doesn't mess with the game. Now, depending on your device, the keybind is going to be different, but we're going to take a screenshot, and I'm going to specifically take it of the area around the game window, which on Windows we can do by pressing Windows, Shift, and S key all at once. And so we can just hold down our left click and drag over the area we want to screenshot. and this should automatically copy the image to our clipboard on Windows. So we can just go into our image editor and paste the screenshot using Control V. In Gamemaker, we're going to select the option to crop/pad, then click the screenshot somewhere that the full game view is within the image bounds and make sure the rectangle highlight tool is selected. We want to highlight just the game window and nothing else. Once we have the area we want selected, we can click Image and then crop all frames to selection. If your image size at the bottom here isn't a multiple of 320 by 240, you probably did something wrong and should try again. Also, if your game screenshot is blurry, your device not save screenshots as PNG files, and you should try to see if you can change that somehow or use a program that can save screenshots as .pinch files. Anyhow, we now want to resize our image to the original resolution, and to do that in Gamemaker, we want to click Image and then resize all frames. Under Scale Image, we want to set width and height to 320 by 240 and make sure to scale in pixels with interpolation off. Now 1 pixel in the image should actually be 1 pixel. Now we can use that to our advantage by highlighting the first menu box and look at the dimensions shown down here. Note that the text stating the selection dimensions disappears when you let go of the mouse button. Okay, and then we can also put our mouse over the top left pixel of the box to see where on the screen it is located in the very bottom left. And with that, we have the values we need to draw the first menu box. This might seem like a long process, but you get used to it pretty quickly, and it's invaluable when trying to figure out the exact numbers you want for something, since it's not just limited in use to the boxes themselves, but we can also use it to find the exact pixel differences between text elements or the menu sol or whatever we want. Just as a note though, anything that has a position that gets randomized might not show its actual position when you take the screenshot. For example, if you took a screenshot of the character naming screen, all the letters would show up in perfect rows in the screenshot. This method can also be used to compare our game with Undertale or Deltarune. For example, let's plug in these values and make sure it's the same as the original game. Now, as you can see here, I have all the different boxes of the menu and different screenshots in a separate program that I already went through and obtained the values we need from. As practice, you can go through and try doing it yourself, but to save time in the video, I'll just show you all the values we need for that going forward. And of course, you may adjust all of these values as you please. This is your game after all. I'm just showing you how I try to make it as accurate as possible. Okay, so back in our menus code, we can start using the create event to define all the values we're going to use. First, we'll start off with the variables we're going to need for our different boxes, so let's write that in a comment here. Then let's have our box just be our box print, so we don't have to type that out every time. And we'll have frame as -1 so that it animates as normal, assuming it has animation, and if not, it won't do anything. Now we gotta start our top box's Y position to 26 and our bottom ones to 84. In Undertale and Deltarune, the Light World / Undertale's menus mini-stat preview can change position based on the player's position on the screen, or if the player's in the upper half of the screen, the box is on the top, and if the player's in the bottom half, it too is on the bottom, as we can see in the screenshots on screen now. This is why we need to have variables that hold the different positions accordingly. First, box.top should be set to box top Y, since it's the default top box position. We can have the same thing for bottom too, but instead of the top pause, we want 161 as the value. We can then have a variable that tracks which position to use called box.stats_mini_y, which we can just set as box.top as a default. Next, we need the x values for the left and right boxes, which we can set as 16 and 94 respectively. For the left and right boxes width, we can use 71 and 173. The reason we're setting all these variables like this instead of just typing them separately when drawing each box is that 1, they are reused by some other boxes, and 2, it makes the code easier to read. Anyhow, now we want to set the height for the mini stats box, which is 55. The select box height is 74. And now for the right box, we want to set the heights for each of the different views. Box item H is 181, stats is 209, and cell is 135. Since the height of the right box is variable, we can create a variable to keep track of which height to use, and as a default, we can just say item. The last of the box variables we'll need for now is the money offset, because in Deltarune and I believe earlier patches of Undertale, the money amount the player has is one pixel to the left of the LV and HP. You can set it to 1 if you want the offset, and just not have it at all if you don't. If you want a different offset for some reason, you can also put in a different value. Now let's move on to the draw event. First off, we can replace the previous values with our new variables, which again are the same thing, they're just more readable. In this case, the sprite is box, frame is frame, xpos is box left x, ypos is box stats mini y, the width is box left w, and the height is box stats mini h. Let's run it and see it. Alright, and that seems to be working. The only thing is that it's currently only basing its position from the coordinates 0, 0, which means it won't move when we do. So in order to test if it does, let's move the object from the title room to a room big enough that we can move around, and that the camera will also be able to move around and not just be a static shot. Alright, so if we run this now and go into our room, the menu doesn't show up unless we go to the top left of the room. To fix this, we need to add an X and Y offset to the position of the box so that we're adding all these values from the top left of the screen and not the top left of the room. Hi, this is Future Noel talking. After recording this section, I realized I actually started referencing an object that you wouldn't know to add if you didn't follow the old part 13. If you don't have this object, you want to create one called center with no object prefix before it, and put in this code you see on screen here in the draw event and make sure visible is set to true. Once you do this, place it in your title room and optionally give it a sprite. Which won't be visible in game, it's purely just for in the editor. This object will always be at the center of your screen, which makes it an easy way to reference those coordinates in the code. Now, back to Past Noel. Now, back under menu, create event, we can create the variables x offset and y offset, which we can just set to center.top left x and y. Now, in our draw event, we can add the x and y offsets to the x and y positions. We also need to make sure this value is updated in our step event as well, so we can just copy and paste it there. Now's a good time to also update the mini-stat box location based off of player position. We just need an if statement saying if the player is below the center of the screen in the y direction, to have mini-stats ypos be the bottom one, because remember, greater y values are lower on the screen, and then we just need an else statement saying that otherwise we want to set it to the top value. Now, if we run the game, it should show up on our screen no matter where we walk, and the stop menu should go to the bottom if the player gets low enough and is on the bottom half of the screen. Don't worry about restricting player movement yet, we'll do that in a bit. Now let's draw the select box. Its variables are box, frame, box left x plus offset, box bottom y plus y offset, box left width, and box select height. Now let's run it and make sure it works. Great. Now before we start programming the right box, we should start adding the text we need to display. In our create event, we can make a text section and create variables for name, which should just be global.name, LV, which you can set as whatever we want until we do the battle tutorials, HP and HP max, which same thing, and money/gold, which we can properly set up in a bit. But for now, we can put whatever. Back in the draw event, we first need to make sure we're drawing our text with the right settings. So let's, below the box, draw encode, and make sure to left align our text, make it white, and set the font to our main sans font. Then we can draw the text with the xpos at the box left x plus x offset plus 8, pos at box stats mini y plus y offset plus 5, and finally the name. We can then run the game to make sure it works. Alright, and now we want to set our font to small for the different stats. Then let's copy and paste that the name draw text code and change 5 to 22 and name to the string LV. Now copy that line and change to 8 to 26 and the string to the variable LV. Now let's run that and see how it is. Okay, And now we can copy and paste that for HP, changing the 22s to 31s, and LV to HP. Since we are displaying the HP out of the max HP with a slash in the middle, we need to turn HP into a string that we can concatenate with the slash after it and concatenate the max HP at the end to give us the fraction we desire. Again, we can run the test. Alright, and then we can copy the LV lines again and change the 22s to 40s and change the string to either a $sign or a capital G, depending on what monetary system your game uses, which could even be something else if you want. Then we need to change the variable to our money variable, and then we need to subtract the money offset from the 26 here if you're using it. And then we can test one more time for the mini stat box. Perfect, and now we can get on with adding the select box text. First off, we need to reset the font to the main sans font. Then we just gotta draw text our box left x since it's on the left and our x offset plus 26 for the right amount of spacing. The box bottom y plus the y offset and 10 with the text item. Then we can just copy and paste that for stat, but add 18 to the 10 for proper spacing between words and repeat that for cell. Now we can run it and this should show up. Once that's done, we want to implement the ability to actually select one of the options and open the right menu. First off, in the create event, we need to create a select section. First, we need a variable called selected that will keep track of which option we have selected. We also need a variable called selected item, which will remember what item we were on when we clicked on one. If that's confusing, it should make sense in a bit. We also need a variable called submenu that will keep track of which submenu we're currently in as a string for readability. We will then need to import a soul sprite to use if we don't have one already. To get one, you can go to the sprite's resource and description for Undertale, and we can scroll down to miscellaneous and click the human souls and download. Of course, if you're using a monster soul or your own soul design, you can import that yourself. Just keep in mind that the soul used in menus is smaller than the one used in battles, and it's the one with a single pixel at the bottom, while the one in battle has 2 pixels at the bottom. So if you want the menu soul in a different color, make sure that you recolor the right soul that's used for menus and not the battle one. Now, in Gamemaker, we need to create an object for the soul, which you can place wherever it makes sense to you, and I will be putting it under the UI folder and call it sbr_soul_menu. Now, back in our menu object, let's at the bottom add a variable called soul that will keep track of what our soul sprite is. Okay, and now for the position variables we're going to use. First, soul x left will be box left plus x offset plus 16, and the y variant will be box bottom y plus y offset plus, in parentheses, selected times 18. All this does is add or subtract 18 to the y pos of the soul when the index of what we have selected changes, which will be 0 when we have the first option selected, since we're starting counting at 0, and 0 times 18 is 0. The next set of variables we'll need is soul x right, which we're going to want to set to be the box right x plus x offset plus 12, and then the soul y right, which equals box bottom y plus y offset plus 18 plus, in parentheses, selected times 18. And finally, we want soul_x to equal soul x left, and the same for y. Okay, and at the bottom of our draw event, we can have a comment to show this is where we're updating the soul position. We have to do this at the end because Gamemaker draws things in the order that we code them, so if we did this before we drew the menu would draw over the soul. We'll worry about getting it to move to the different positions in the menu when we select different sub-menus later. For now, let's just do it for the select submenu. So if submenu equals select, and then we can just copy and paste our last 4 lines from the create event, and at the very bottom, put draw sprite soul frame soul x soul y. Okay, and before we can properly test this, we need to program in the ability to actually move in the menu. So above this, let's have a section called navigate submenu. Now to start off, all we need to do is have an if submenu equals select, and submenu is less than 2, and global.down button pressed once, selected plus plus. else if submenu is select and selected is greater than 0, and global.up and press once, selected minus minus. Now let's run the game and make sure everything is okay. Okay, and now we need the code that actually changes what submenu we have focused. Below what we just wrote, let's say if submenu equals select and selected equals 0 and select button pressed, submenu equals item. Else if submenu equals item and cancel button pressed, submenu equals select and selected equals 0. Then we can add an else and copy and paste the first two if statements and change it from item to stat and selected equals 1, as well as delete the selected equals 0. Add an else and paste it again for this time cell and change it to selected equals 2 in the if statement and in the cancel if statement. The reason we're setting it in here is to make sure that even if we move in the item or cell submenu, that when we cancel out of it, we keep the soul on the option we selected. Wonderful. Now we can move on to actually drawing the right box. Above where we did the submenu code, let's add a right box section. First, to keep the size of the right box updated, we're going to say if submenu equals menu, box right h equals box item h, else if submenu equals stat, box right h equals box stats h, else if submenu equals cell, box right h equals box cell h. Okay, and that should be good on the height, so now we need to actually draw the right box. Since it's only ever and always going to be drawn when we're not in the select submenu, we can say if submenu does not equal select to draw box frame, box right x plus x offset, box top y plus y offset, box right w, and box right h. Okay, and now we should be able to run the game, and our right menu can be opened up with the different sizes based on the one we selected and can be exited out of. Now, to draw the item names, we can below this say if submenu equals item or submenu equals items options, and have a for loop in that. That's for var I equals 0, I is less than array length, global inventory, I++. This will be what we want to use to loop through each item we have and only do it for the length of the size of our inventory. Now inside that we can draw text, box right x plus x offset plus 22, box top y plus y offset plus 14 plus I times 18 in parentheses. And finally, global.inventory I.name. This will draw our items 18 pixels apart from each other based on the value of I in our current loop. Since Gamemaker runs every iteration of the loop in one frame, we don't have to worry about something like only one of the item names being displayed per frame. Anyway, let's run it and test. Perfect. Now we can draw the text for the item options. First, we want to draw text box right x plus x offset plus 22, box top y plus y offset plus 154, and use. Then we can copy and paste this twice and just change the values we want. First, we want to change it to info and then drop. We want to change to 22 to 27 and then 133 respectively, and we can also test that. Then in our menu navigation code, we can add two cases for the item option submenu by copying and pasting the first two if statements in the code and changing the name. Now down here, we're going to also do the same thing by copying and pasting the first two if statements, but also adding some extra code that remembers which item we selected to access the item options. We have to do this since the item we can be on to get to the options can be variable, and we won't always know which one to return to when we exit that section. Anyhow, we want to say selected item equals selected, and below that selected equals 0, which will make sure we always start on the first option. Then in the last statement, we just want to change 0 to selected item. Wonderful. Now we just gotta make sure to update the soul position. To do that, we're just gonna go to the bottom here and add else if submenu equals item, and in it just copy and paste what we had in the first one, and then go up to our create event and copy the soul right lines to replace the left ones and change the left to right in the last two lines. Then we can copy and paste the first statement's code again. This time, delete the soul left code and type soul x bot equals right box right x plus x offset plus 14 plus, in parentheses, selected times 50, and on the next line have an if selected equals 2, and then copy and paste the first line and change the 14 to 24. The reason for this is because if you noticed before, all the item options are 50 pixels apart, but the final one has an additional 10 pixel offset. Now we want to say sol y bot equals box top y plus y offset plus 164, and then change the left to bottom in the last two lines. Perfect. Now we can test, and great, that's looking all good. Just make sure that you have items actually in your inventory as we went over before doing this. Next, we'll be adding the stat menu text. First, we gotta add the variables we're gonna use in our create event. Again, all of these values are just gonna be temporary until we implement the battle system. First, we need comments, which will either display the chapter we started on or some other kind of comments such as easy to change, huh? In Undertale, when you edit your name to be more than 6 letters in the files, which can also, usually in Undertale, it just doesn't display any comments. I'll say, since chapter 1 as a placeholder text for now. Next, attack for our base attack, weapon attack for our weapon attack, defense for our base defense, armor defense for the armor's defense, XP for EXP, and we have to drop the E because EXP is already used as a function name in Gamemaker. Then next level, which will be how much XP we need to get to the next level, /love. Weapon for weapon, which we can select from our inventory to test, and same for armor. Now, before we draw the text, let's make sure that the sol stops drawing when we select the stat menu. All we need to do at the bottom is where we draw our sol, add an if statement around it for when the submenu isn't stat. Okay, and now let's go to below where we draw the item and add a stat and cell section. Then let's have an if statement for when submenu is stat, and in it have a draw text, box right x plus x offset plus 14, box top y plus y offset plus 16, and then 2 quotation marks plus name plus another 2 quotation marks. Then inside each of the quotation marks, put a backslash and put just 1 quotation mark. This way we can display the quotes around the name within the string. Next, to draw the comments, copy and paste the same thing, but this time replace the name in quotes with comments and change the 14 to 96. As a side note, when you are testing something yourself to make sure the pixel values are right, make sure to have the same name and stuff to guarantee accuracy. Okay, and now to display the actual stats, we can paste again, but this time we want to change our 16 to 46, and our text to be displayed as level with 2 spaces afterwards, not just 1, and then a plus sign, and then plus string LV. Make sure that you have 2 parentheses at the end. Okay, and we can copy paste that for HP, but change 46 to 62 and add plus in quotation marks a slash plus string HP max, and make sure again that you have 2 parentheses at the end. Then we can copy and paste those 2 lines and change the Y values to 94 and 110, and the strings to attack and defense with 2 spaces still, and for attack we can change the string LV to string attack, and plus a space and a left parentheses, plus a space and a right parentheses, and in between the 2 we can add a string weapon attack. Then we can copy and paste that whole thing right there for of the string and paste it for defense, and just change it to defense. Then let's copy the LV line and change the values to 98 and 94, and change the string to EXP with 1 space this time, not 2, and change the LV variable to EXP. We can copy and paste this line and change 94 to 110 and say next, again with 1 space, and change EXP to next underscore LV. We can copy paste the LV line again, and this time change 46 to 176 and say money with 1 space again, and change LV to money. Alright, that should be all for that stat menu, so let's test it. Great, now on to the cell menu. First off, we need to put an if statement for when the submenu is cell. Now, before we do anything else, why don't you take a moment to consider how we keep track of possible people to call and who we currently can and what they'll say. If you need a hint, we've done something similar earlier in the episode. Pause now if you like. Done? Well, how I'm going to do it is by making another struct, this time that holds all the call information that we need. In our initializer objects, we can first add a comment at the top that signifies that this is the item section, and we can add one at the bottom for cell. First, let's actually make our global struct cell, and in it have a struct for someone we want to be able to call, which I'll do tutorial as an example. Remember to make structs and variables inside of structs to use a colon and not an equal sign. Then, inside of the tutorial struct, we can have a variable called name, which is usually that character's name, but in Deltarune, tutorial is listed as call home, so don't feel constrained to following a strict pattern like that with just the name. Make sure to put a comma after the name line, and we can add text, which can be anything for now until we actually implement text boxes later on. We can also change the name or text that's displayed as things happen in the game, which we will go over in a later tutorial. We can add more people to call if we want by adding a comma at the end of the struct and copy and pasting it afterwards without a comma if it's the last one. Now that we have that done, we can create a global contacts array that will keep track of who we can call at any given moment. Think of this as our cell phone inventory, like what we did with our item inventory up here. Just like that one, we will be able to add and remove contacts as the game goes on. To add to our default list of contacts for testing, we can just say global.cell. And then the name of the person we want to add. Before we move on, it's useful to know that you can collapse structs on the sides here if they're too big and make navigating the code confusing. This also applies to if statements and to loops. Anyhow, in our draw event, we want to add a for loop, which we can just copy from the item one up here. Just change inventory to contacts in both instances. And that should be it. Now, to actually navigate the menu, we just need to make sure that we have selected equals 0 when we open the select submenu. And then above that, copy and paste the item if statements to navigate and replace item with cell and inventory with contacts. Now we should be able to test it and have everything work as intended. Perfect! And now let's move on to making the menu delete itself when we exit out of it. To make sure it only closes when we want it to, we can create a variable called can_close, which will be true by default. We will then make sure to set it to true if we're in the selection submenu. We can then set it to false whenever we open a new submenu like this. And finally, we can at the bottom add a section called destroy, which when the cancel button is pressed and can close is true, will let the player move again and will destroy the menu. To actually make this menu something that we can spawn with the menu button, we can first remove it from the room we were testing it in and create an object_menu spawner, and in that make sure persistent is unchecked but visible is. Then add a draw event and say if keyboard check pressed global.menu button and instance exists, object player, and object player that can move, to then create the menu at xy00 at the xy00 and depth -1000 and set players can move to false. We can then move the spawner into the title room and make it actually do stuff. Now we should be able to test and have everything work. Great! Now let's add actual stats we can reference throughout the code for our player. In our initialize objects, we can add a struct at the bottom for stats. We will also use this for enemy and other party member stats. For our player, the stats we want are name, which will set to global.name, HP, which will do 20, HP max, which same thing, attack, which 9, defense, which 10, and magic, which 0, weapon, which can be whatever you want, same with armor, level 1, XP 0, next level 10, money 0, and spells as an empty array. These will be the default values when you start the game out with. These will be the default values you start the game out with, and feel free to change them as you like. These are just example stats, and I myself will likely change these later on. We'll add support for levels / love and magic and stuff in later vids. I'll also add party member and magic support to the Undertale battle system, by the way. For party members, we'll use all the same variables. For enemies, we need name, HP, attack, defense, XP gain, and money gain. If there are enemies you fight multiple times with different stats in different battles, just make another instance of that enemy here and add a 2 or something at the end of the struct name and change the stats as needed. We also need a Dark World stat struct with the stats we want for the Dark World, which are going to be stronger than the Light World usually. There are still a few things we need to add to our menu to have everything working, but first it's about time we improve our save system. Before now, we've been using INI files to save our game, but now we're going to switch to JSON. The reason for this is that JSON files will let us very easily save and load arrays and structs and not just strings and numbers. You can certainly use INI files for that, but JSON files make it just that much easier and also support better organization. With that said, let's start off by going to our game's save location and delete that INI file. If you have a controls.ini file, don't worry about deleting it because we'll cover an improvement on custom controls in a later vid. Also, and before we start doing anything else, this is a good time to go through and delete the old dialog system if you still have it. That means go to your objects and delete the mcontrol, mobject dialog, and msfx. Once you do that, press Control or Command on Mac, Shift F, and search for all times those objects are referenced in the code and delete what you see on the screen here. Make sure to also delete any code in your creation code for both save points and interact objects, if you have that. If you want to save the dialog for later reference, you can copy it and save it in a Google spreadsheet or other program, somewhat like this. The exact formatting can be up to you. I also want to say that I'm renaming my object player to object main Kara, just because within the metaphysics of Undertale and Deltarune, the player is a separate entity from the character we control, and that's what the original games called the character in the code itself. To do this, just rename the object and press Ctrl Shift F to find any instances of player and change it to main Kara or whatever you want. Also, make sure to change any instances of the player layer in rooms and the term player in sprites and whatever other assets to main Kara. Now's a good time to quick mention that it's important every now and again to use Ctrl Shift F and to find and delete any debug messages we aren't using anymore. Okay, and now back to the safe stuff. To get started, we actually need to have a JSON file that we can read. In our initialization object, we can add a create event and inside it a global var called JSON, which we can set to any string we want. This will be the name of the JSON file that your game saves. You can give it a JSON file ending if you'd like, but it really can be anything or not even have a file extension at all, since Gamemaker will read it as a JSON regardless. I'll make it a custom .save file since I just like that more, but as long as you understand that no matter what you call the file, that it's a JSON under the hood, we can move on. Next, we want to add a global slot variable, which will keep track of the save slot we're currently in, which we will also be adding support for today, which can range from slot 1 to infinity, although realistically, after a certain point, Gamemaker is not going to like the really big numbers. Anyhow, we will do a save slot selection menu in a later video. Now, in our title object, we want to delete the party IDs code here, room IDs, the INI save code, the room and party stuff down here, and the DS map code if you still have it from the old dialog vids. Now, make sure to have the code that creates our buttons checked for the JSON instead, and that we didn't start a new game. If you deleted the new game variable previously, since we didn't use it before, we can just add it under the other create code in our initialization objects with a default value of true. Now make sure to copy and paste all the non-button spawning related code from the title object to the init object with the create event code pasted under the game start code, unless you have some other kind of unique code that needs to be elsewhere. If you don't have these time variables from the old part 12 or this language stuff from the old part 11, ignore them on my screen. I'll go over them in the new videos. Also make sure to add a has cell variable that will track if we have the cell phone. Now to actually read our lovely JSON file, we will create a script that we can call at any time to do so. Let's call this script strjson.var. In the parameters, we can have one called JSON, which will equal the global JSON by default, but which you can change if you ever need. Now in the code itself, we want to check if our JSON exists. Then we want to create a var called file, which we will make the JSON file itself. Then we'll create a variable called text that will store the contents of the JSON. Now to actually get these contents in our text var, we will create a while loop which will continue to run while we aren't reading the text at the end of the file. And the code we will run is adding the next line of text in our file to our text variable. Then all we need to do is close out the file and create a var called save, which we will use one of Gamemaker's built-in functions to convert our text variable into either a struct or an array based on the contents of the JSON and return the save variable. If you want to read more about these functions, you can refer to the relevant pages in the Gamemaker code reference. We can optionally add an else at the end here and show an error telling us if the JSON we're trying to reference doesn't exist. This can be useful in certain scripts that you're making when you're adding new features like this, because it can tell you if you messed up your code at some point and need to make sure that you aren't trying to load a save in this case where none exists, or whatever specific case may exist for the feature adding. And great, so now let's add a script that'll save the game for us when we call it. For the parameters, we can have slot, which will be the save slot we want to save with a default of the current one, which this parameter will be useful in the Deltarune scene menu with multiple slots available to save to. And we'll also have sounds, which will determine whether or not we want to play the save sound effect with the default value of false. Okay, we need to actually manage our slots in a way we can easily access and manipulate. So let me actually explain how we're going to store everything now. As I mentioned before, we can store both arrays and structs inside of JSON files, opposed to the single values of INI files. This makes things very convenient for us when accessing and writing information, since it's all very organized and not complicated to do more complex operations. Specifically, how we're going to organize it is we're going to have the JSON hold an array, with each index of that array corresponding to a save slot, which holds a struct with all the data we need for our game neatly organized. Just to keep things simpler and to prevent a ton of adding and subtracting ones, the 0th index of this array will simply hold a value with the number of save slots. This not only lets us easily know how many slots there are in the code by just quick checking the JSON, but also means that index 1 is slot 1 and index 2 is slot 2, etc. Now to actually do this, we need to go to our init object and add an array called slots. Then if our JSON exists, we want to create a var that holds our save data called save using the script we just made. Then we need to create a global variable called numSlots and set it to the 0th index of the array. Otherwise, let's set it to 1. Then we want to say if our slot is greater than the number of slots, set the number of slots to the same value as our current slot. Then, to ensure every index of 0 after array is a struct, we can do a simple for var I equals 1, I is less than global num slots, and I plus plus, and set our slot I to empty curly brackets. We need to actually hold all that data from our save to our slots array. First, we need to make sure the JSON exists. Then we want to check if the length of save minus 1 is less than array length slots. And inside that, we got to array resize save array length save to make it one bigger, and then have a for loop where I equals array length save, I is less than the length of slots, I plus plus, and then we resize it as before again and set save I to empty curly brackets. Then in a separate for loop, we want to say I equals 1, I is less than or equal to global num slots I plus plus, and slots I equals save I. Then all we need is to set a variable called slot to slots global.slot. We can now just type slot to access our current slot. Then after this if statement, say that global.slots equals slots so that we can reference it elsewhere. Speaking of, in our save script, we want to start copy and pasting the save code from the save objects. Please ignore any code that you see here that you don't have. For example, if you have the old time management code, you can put that here at the start, and if not, I'll cover it in the new part 12. All we need to change is replace the old time line here with if file exists, our JSON, and new game is false. And then we want to set our old time to global.slots slot game.time, which we'll actually set up in a second here, and also we'll set to 0. Next, we need to set up our party stuff. To do so, we need an array called party. Then we need a set of our called party size to the length of the global party array, which we actually need defined in our init object with our other global variables. Then we want to array size party size and create a for loop where I equals 0. We loop for each iteration that I is less than party size, and I plus plus to increase I each loop. Then inside it, we want to array sets party index I and set it to object get name global.party I. This will fill our party array with a string containing the object names of all of our party members. Now for the actual struct that we'll be saving, let's call it save and have the first section called main.chara. We'll save the name as global.name, main.chara x as object main.chara x, same for y, facing as main.chara facing direction, inv as global.inv, const as global.const, cell as global.hatCell, and attack as our attack. Same with defense, magic, weapon, armor, money, HP, HP max, LV, and XP. For our next two sections, we'll have game, which we can just write slot to and save the slot. RM, which will save the room using room get name room, and time, which if you have the time code from the old part 12, will be time to save. And otherwise exclude it for now, and then we'll also have the party section, which will have exists, which will be global.party exists, and party array, which will be our party array we just made. Then after we make this struct, we want to set our global slots 0 to equal the number of slots so that we can reference that later. We also want to set global.slots slot to the save we just made, and we want to create a dummy variable called slots_dummy and set it to our global.slots so that we can preserve the information, which we'll need in just a second now. And we want to set our global slots to JSON stringify global.slots true and set a variable called file to file text open write global.json, and we want to write file text write string file global.slots and then close the file. Now we can set our global slots to our dummy variable to make sure it doesn't stay as the string we just made it using the stringify function. We needed to save it as a text file. Then we need to make sure we set global.newGame to false and say that if sound equals true, str sound snd save. We have yet to implement ser snd yet, so let's do that now real quick. Just create it under our scripts with the parameters snd, volume equals 1, and pitch equals 1. The reason we're doing this is because Gamemaker's built-in script has a long name and has a lot of parameters that we won't really use. Of course, you can still use them with our scripts, but we just set their default values to what we will normally want. Anyhow, all we need to say is audio play sounds snd 1 false fall pitch. And we're done with the script. Now, onto our object save. Let's, where the old code was, place our scr save. Don't worry that I have extra stuff here from the old part 12. Just wherever you have code from the old part for saving, put the scr. Here's what it should look like if you don't have the code from that video. Back in the if statement in our init object, we need another if statement to check if our current slot has any data saved in it. If so, we want to actually load this data by saying global.newGame equals false, global.name equals slot.mainChar.name, global.startRoom equals asset get index slot.game.room, global.startX equals slot.mainChar.mainChar.x. Same for y. Global.partyExists equals bool slot.party.exists. If global.partyExists, global party member 1 equals asset get index slot.party.party array 0. Same for party member 2. Global party member 1 follow distance equals 40, and global party member 2 follow distance equals 80, or whatever you had those values set to before. Now, to make sure we load the player stats if they were updated, at the very bottom we can add an if, checking for the JSON and that it's not a new game, that will set all of our main car stats to the stats that we have saved in our current slot. I'll just leave what we need on screen for you to copy since it's a lot to read. You'll notice that I commented out the weapon and armor ones. This is because our weapons and armors are stored as structs within structs that we identify and save using the ID variable we made before, which we can't just directly set our weapon and armor values to, since they are stored as structs, not the strings we saved them as. This is why we need to make a script that will read our weapon/armor ID and convert it into the proper struct for us. We'll add the script equipable ID convert and add a parameter called equipable with no default value. In practice, this will be the ID of the equipment we're trying to convert. So first, let's set a var called item and set it to a random equipment just as a default value. Then we want to say if struct exists, global.item.weapon and equipable, which will just check if our item we want exists in our weapon struct, and if so, we want to set our item var to it using struct get. Then we want to else if and do the same thing with armor, and after that, we just got to return our item value. Back in our initialization object, we can uncomment these lines and add our scr after the equal sign, and as the parameter, put the weapon and armor of the save in this slot. Now, the same issue also applies to our items where we need to convert them from strings to structs. Since we're going to have quite a few scripts for stuff with our inventory, let's create a group within our scripts called inventory and move the script we just made into it. Then let's create one called update list and have the parameter load set to false by default, which is just whether or not we're loading a new save. If so, and it's not a new game, we want to have a variable called save be our JSON, set global.inv to the save slots saved inventory, and same for const. Now, to actually convert these lists to contain proper structs, we're going to create another script called list ID convert. To shorten things, we'll have two variables for our global inventory vars like this. Then we want to set array resize in the array length inv, and then have a for loop where I equals 0, I is less than array length inv, I++, where we set a var called item ID to inventory to inv I. Then we'll have an if struct exists, global.item.food item ID and set inv_i to struct get global.item.food item ID, and then do an else if for each of the other types of item. We're going to do something similar for cell as well. Let's have these two vars for our global contact variables, then array resize contacts array length const, and create a for loop with I equals 0, I is less than array length const, I plus plus. Then just set caller ID equal to const I and const I to struct get global.cell caller ID. Perfect. And now we're done with this script, and we can put it in the other one and just say exit afterwards to let the script know that it can stop running. After that if statement, we want to set our global.inv to an empty array and create a for loop where I equals 0, I is less than array length global inventory, I plus plus, and then array resize global.inv array length global.inv, and array set global.inv I global.inventory I.id. Okay, and then we can go ahead and do the same thing for const and be done with the script. We will need to use the script anytime we want to update either our inventory or cell list. So in our initialization object, let's add it in after we define our global contacts array and make sure to put true in as a parameter. Fantastic! And that should be everything we need to do regarding the new save system. Now we can get back to some of the menu stuff, and then after that, implement shops. I would recommend that you test that things work as intended now and fix any issues that you have before moving onward. Now, we want to create some scripts and add and remove items, contacts, and let us equip things. First, we'll add a cell add script with contact as a parameter. We'll set const to our contacts array, index to its length, resize const to be one bigger, and set the newly created space to the contact we want to add. Then, we just want to update our lists. For the cell delete script, the only param we want is index, which by default will be the array length of our contacts minus 1. Then we just need an array delete global.contacts index 1 and update the lists. For item add, the param will be item, inv as our shortened inventory as usual. If our inventory is at the max capacity of 8 items, then we want to exit the script. We want the index for adding the item to be at the end of the array, so then we'll resize it to be large enough and set that index to our item and update the lists. Item delete will be the same thing as cell delete, but we change contacts to inventory. We also want an eat script for eating food. The two params are index and target, with the latter having the default value of the main car's stats. We want a variable called food to be global.inventory index, and HP to be target.hp, and HP max to be target.hp max, and cap to be true. Cap, short for capacity, will determine if we want to allow this item to heal above the normal max HP. To give a food this property, just go back to the initialization object, and before we define all the items, add a variable called cap that you can set to literally anything. All we need is for it to exist. Then in the item we want to ignore the cap, just add cap and don't set it to anything. Then back in the eat script, add an if HP is greater than HP max or struct exists food cap, and set cap to false. Then we want to add to our HP the amount the food heals. If HP is greater than HP max and cap, then we want to set HP to HP max. Then update target HP to HP, and if you have an item like the bicycle from Undertale that has multiple uses, you can add checks for that here. First, let's add a variable called del that will check if we should delete our item or not. Then, to check for the multi-use items, we want to say if food equals global.inventory index equals global.item.food.unisical, and del equals false. Of course, you can change this as it applies to your game. These items are just an example. After that, we gotta check if del is true, and if so, delete the current food that we just ate. Now, just update the list and play the needed sounds. Make sure to download the SND swallow and SND heal sounds from the sounds resource if you don't have them already. Once you have those, make sure to use our SND script from earlier to play the swallow sounds. Since the heal sound plays after the swallow sounds, and scripts don't run over multiple frames, it's necessary that we create an object that will wait for the swallow sound to finish, and then play the heal sound after a few frames. Let's call it object heal sounds and add a create and step event. In the create, all we need is a timer, which we can set to 20 frames, or however many frames after the swallow sound you want the heal sound to play. Then in step, we want to make sure sound swallow isn't playing, and that our timer is less than or equal to 0. And then play the heal sound and destroy the instance, and after the if statement, subtract 1 for the timer. Now all we need to do is create this object at the end of our eat script, and we're done with it. To equip stuff, we want one script for weapons and one for armor. Let's start with weapons. For the parameter, we want index of the weapon to equip. Sets inv as usual, weapon old to our currently equipped weapon, and weapon new to inv index. Then sets inv index to weapon old, and global.stats.mainchara.weapon to weapon new, and update the lists. Now copy this code and paste it in the armor equip script. All you need to do is press Ctrl F and toggle replace weapon with armor. Okay, and now before we get back to the menu stuff, let's move everything from the title room to a place called place_initialize that will set everything up for us before the game starts, except for the title object itself and anything else that you specifically have chosen to put there. Also make sure the title uses a create event and not a game start anymore. In your new initialization room, make sure to enable viewports and check viewport 0 to visible and give it the settings that you had in the title room. Also, be sure to set this as the new home room in the game that we start in by placing it at the top of the room order. Finally, at the end of our initialization object, we just need to say room_go_to room title. Alrighty, back to the menu. In the create event, be sure that when defining the weapons, you use the weapons from the main car stats and not hard-code it as one single item. Now, to wrap up this menu, let's add in the sounds and the ability to drop and use things. First, let's just play the Undertale squeak sound when we navigate the menu. Then we want to check for when we use an item like this. Inside, we want to check if the item was selected is a food, and if so, eat it. Create a variable in create called close that will close the menu when set to true, which is exactly what we want to do after running the eat script. Then we want to do the same thing for both weapons and armor, but for both of those also play sound_item from Undertale. After that, we need to check for when we drop an item, which will be the same thing but selected equals 2. All we need for this is to delete our script and set close to true. Now, the very final thing we'll be doing with the menu today is to make it so that it grays out our item in the cell menus when we have nothing in them to select, and also make it so that the cell menu only shows up once we have a phone. To do this, in the create, we need to add a has item variable with default false, item_color, which default C_gray, and same thing for cell and cell color. Then, if you have any items, set the color to white and has item to true. If you have any contacts, set cell color to white. Then, where we draw the names of the options, add color to the end of the draw_text, and add 4 item_colors to the end of the function, and then a 1. Repeat the same process for cell with cell color, but also add an if statement around it, checking if we have the phone. If you want to test to make sure your cell menu is working, just set has_cell to true in your initialization objects. Whenever in game you want to give the player their phone, you just set this has cell variable to true. You can also take the phone away from the player by setting it to false. and it will remember this in the save system, and it will also remember your contacts list even if you temporarily lose your phone. And of course, just use the cell add and delete scripts we made to adjust the contacts list as needed throughout the game. We'll go over how exactly to do that in a later video. For now, let's move on. Great, we can finally get onto adding shops into our Fangame. Hopefully by this point in the video, you have an easier time understanding what we're doing, why and get how. Everything we've done with the menu is extremely helpful at this stage. I also hope that that this has helped you understand how to break larger systems down into smaller and more manageable pieces. To start off, we need a shop object that will manage everything for us. First, in the create, let's define all the possible items that we can buy at shops in the game in a struct called items. If you want one shop to sell the same items as another at a different price or something like that, just create another struct with the same item struct within that, and just put a 2 after it or something in the struct name and change the price. The variables you want in each item struct are name, price, type, which can be weapon, armor, or food, stat, which is the stat it grants, description, and item, which is the item itself in the global item struct. For food that's multi-use, you can make an HP stat. You can make the HP stat a string and add this string to the end of it so that it shows up right in the shop menu. I will be adding both QC's and Gerson's Undertale shops in this video. Speaking of, let's start adding structs for the shopkeepers we want. Since all these shops are really just the same thing with a different coat of paint, we can simply have our object draw things the same way, but just with the specific details as defined in each shopkeeper struct. To demonstrate, I'll use QC. First off, make sure you have all the relevant sprites from Spider's resource, including the body, face, eyes, mouth, and backgrounds. We won't be doing anything with the face, eyes, and mouth sprites in this video since they're linked to the dialogue system, but we'll just put the variables here to be prepared for when we do that. Anyhow, the variables we want are sprite, face, eyes, mouth, sprite x offset, which in this case should be -1, sprite y offset, which for QC is 56, background x offset, background y offset, which for QC will be 60, and background animation, which should be -1 to just animate it at the default rate, which in this case is not at all since our background state doesn't have any animation. Then we want to have refuse buy, which is a true or false on if the keeper will refuse to buy things or not. Just for showcase purposes, I'm going to say QC does buy stuff for now. So this next part makes sense, which is why we want buy prices struct for keepers to do who do buy things. All we need to do is put the item and the price that they buy it at. If you don't put an item in this list, it will default to 0. Then we need we want font sans and font mono, which would be the mono and sans fonts they use. Last but most certainly not least are the lines of dialogue, which will be in another struct. For the lines to show up while you're buying things, you just need them as a single string like this for buy, thanks, broke, full, and looking. Random flavor will be inside an array with intro and outro. Talk flavor will be just one line as well, since it's in the little side box and not the big one. The talk options will also be an array, with each of the default options we can select to talk to the shopkeeper. You can have as few as 1 and as many as 4. Now, for the actual talking dialogue, we can call each one whenever we want, as long as we understand which option it correlates to. I would recommend prefixing it with talk underscore and either a word related to the option or just the numbers 1 through 4 spelt out. For all the talk dialogue, we need to have each page of dialogue as its own array within the array that contains it all, like this, so that we can use the separation to tell what lines to show when. If you want a line of dialogue to show something new after selecting again, just add another line of dialogue with the same name, but add a 2 at the end, and you can keep adding 1 to this total as much as you'd like. If you want a new dialogue option to show up in yellow text with the word new next to it after you've exhausted all of the other lines for that option, just take the original name for that dialog option and add _new to the end of it. To give this new option a name when selecting it, create a string that has the name of the option with new at the end and add _name to it. This is stackable and combinable, so feel free to add as many additional responses and yellow new responses as you please. Just make sure that if you added any yellow new options, that you add one with the original name and _fin at the end of it. You can add this to be the final indefinitely looping piece of dialogue, even if you didn't add any yellow options. But if you did have yellow dialogue, this line here will turn it white and remove the text that says new. We also need a refuse by dialogue, which you can add repeat alterations to, but not yellow new text options. You also need dialogue for when the player tries to sell with no items. The last few variables we need are warp room, which is the room we want to warp to when we leave, warp x and y, which are the coordinates to warp to, warp facing, which is the direction we want to face when we exit. We're currently using a number to represent this, which is confusing, so let's change it to a string. Press Ctrl-Shift-F to search for any time we use the word facing and replace the numbers with strings of up, down, left, and right. I'll leave a key on screen on what direction you should replace each number with, assuming yours are the same as mine. Also, just make sure that you spell everything right. Now we actually need to figure out who the keeper is of the current shop. For this, we need to add a variable called keeper, but we need to do so by going to the left sidebar here, and under variable definitions, click add variable, and add one called keeper and set the default to whatever you want the default shopkeeper to be by clicking the gear icon and setting the variable type to string. We need to do this because other methods of setting the keeper don't do it before the create event. Okay, so now we need a room for our shop. Let's create a shops folder under our rooms, since each shop will be in its own room. Let's call it rm_shop_qc, since I'm using QC as an example. Then place a shop object in the room and double click on it. Then click variables and make sure you have the right keeper listed. If you want to edit it, click the pencil button and type the keeper name you want. Then we need to make a script called keeper. Set keeper to object_shop.keeper. Then we want to switch the checks for each case of what the keeper could be and set it to that. Be sure to revisit the script every time you add a new keeper, otherwise it won't work. Okay, and then we just gotta place the script in our shop object, which now means the keeper variable is set up right. Then we want to add a switch case for our keepers that'll determine what stock they sell and what their lines of dialogue are. Again, a minimum of 1 and a maximum of 4 for each thing. Unlike with the menu, the shop is 3 pixels thick and not 2. Simply do the same thing we did with the other box, but this time make it 9 by 9 pixels and set the 9 slice to all 4s. Back in the shop objects, we need a variable called box, which we can set to the box we just made, and then we can set a variable called anim to -1. We need a variable that holds the asterisk when drawing text, so let's create that here. We also want an array with all the different options of the shop. Same thing for yes and no. We want our default menu to be select. We want to welcome the player when they enter. We want our selected menu option to be 0. The soul should be the menu soul sprite. We want a menu timer, which will prevent us from doing multiple actions in one frame. The page counter for dialogue should start at 0. The default flavor text when buying should be default. Our yes/no selected variable should be 0. The count for how many times the keeper refused to buy should start at 1. The count for each talk option should also start at 1, as it is in this array. Talk color should be white, and our array for if an option is new should all be false. There are some more variables that we'll need in a few minutes, but for now, the last 3 lines we need are exit timer equals 1, object mainChara.canMove equals false, and object mainChara.y minus equals 50, which will make sure the mainChara can't do anything in the shop. Now, in a draw event, we want to draw our backgrounds as you see here. The only thing of note is that you should be sure to add the X and Y offsets and same with keeper. We want to draw set font to the keeper sans font and set a horizontal line to font align left. I would now recommend creating somewhere in your game where you can enter the shop room to test if everything is working. Now we need to create our select menu. First, we actually need to check for it. Then we gotta draw the left and right boxes with these values. Then we need to draw the flavor text. And to do that, we first want to see if we should show the welcome text. If so, we want a for loop that goes to the length of the number of lines in the intro text. Then we want to make sure we set the font to the mono one and draw the star and the lines like this, and make sure to reset the font to sans. Else, we want to do the exact same thing for the random flavor. As a note, some text might not display 100% accuracy the way we cover in this video, but that will be fixed once we have the proper dialog system implemented. Anyhow, we want to now draw the money the character has like this. If you want a $sign instead, just put a $sign in quotes in front with a plus sign after it like this. Anyhow, we also want to display how full our inventory is by doing the length of it out of 8. Now, to actually navigate the menu, we need a simple check for the button we pressed, as well as making sure we're in the right range of what can be selected, and just make the corresponding movement and play the squeak. To show the soul, all we need to do is this draw sprite. For drawing the text itself, we want to add a for loop up to 4 that draws the options like this. To select an option, we first want to check for selecting something. Then we just need a switch statement for the selected option, and in the case it's a certain one, we want to set our menu to that and set selected to 0 and welcome to false, so that we stop showing the welcome message. Only exit will be different, and all it is setting menu to exit. Okay, and now onto the buy menu. Okay, so in our buy menu, something important to note is that there is this little info menu that pops up on the side with a nice animation. To add this, we're going to use something Gamemaker has called animation curves, which will let us create that smoothness in the animation and any animation we want in our game. I actually found a tutorial by one of Deltarune's programmers, Sarah JS, who did a lot of the visual work for Chapter 4 and is now working on Chapter 5's cutscenes, which I will now ask you to watch to 1, show your support for her, and 2, understand how to use animation curves because I think she does a good job explaining it. She also has some other tutorials I think some people might find useful. Pause the video now to give her a channel and other socials a visit in the description. Back? Well, if you watch the video, you should know we're going to need to first make the animation curve itself. In our animation curve folder, let's add one and call it AC underscore by underscore pop-up. And let's call it animation curve by pop-up. Then click the down arrow to select the type of curve. We definitely want a Bezier curve for that fine control over it. Make sure in the top right you have this middle option selected to both ease in and out. You could also adjust that however you want, but just for our purposes that works. If you want a curve that just eases in or just out for something, select one of the other options. Then we want to use the quart preset for this little pop-up. Of course, you can feel free to experiment with the other options and see if you like them, but I'll go with quart. To actually make the curve a curve, we need to make sure we have our first position at 0, 0 and the second at 1, 1. It's important that if it gives you some decimals after the 1 here, to delete them since it will actually make the pop-up go a quarter of a pixel higher than it should be, which is noticeable when scaling the game up. Once we have the curve itself set up, we can go back to our shop object and add the variables we need. First, we need to set our curve variable to AnimCurve get channel, animation curve by pop-up curve 1. Then we need to have percent, which should be 0. Position should be anim curve, channel, evaluate, curve, percent. We also want info top and bottom, which are the top and bottom positions of the box, at 39 and 123 pixels respectively. We need to have a variable called distance that is the bottom minus the top, and finally one called info y, which would be the current y value of the info box, which we can set to the bottom minus the distance times the pause. Back in the buy menu, we want to first make sure that we increase percent by 1/30 every frame if it's less than 1. Then we want to copy and paste the position and info y variables we created in the create event here. Finally, we can draw the box itself with these values. Now, if we test our game and select buy, we should see the move box up smoothly. To actually draw the text on the box, we want to first make sure we're not on the exit button by saying if selected does not equal array length stock. Then, we want to create a local variable called item that will be the currently selected item in the stock. Then, we'll have a switch statement that checks for the type of item that we have selected. In the case that it's armor, we want to draw text at x 244 and y info y plus 14. We're actually going to introduce a new feature that lets us draw variables in a string more easily for the string here. All we need to do is put a $sign before the quotation marks, and after the text we want to draw, put in our curly brackets the variable we want to draw inside them, like this, and then the rest of our string afterwards. This is one of the many awesome things that Sarah talks about in her tutorial, so please go check out the other ones. Now we need to actually draw the other boxes. Here are all the positionings that we need to draw them. The keeper always has some flavor text on the side when we're buying things, so for that we need to set our font to be the keeper's mono font. Then we want to switch for the buy flavor text that we want to display. For our default case, we want to draw it at 230, 130, and just draw the default bylines and break. We can copy and paste the same thing and change the values for broke, thanks, full, buying, and looking. The only ones that we need to do something special for is buying, which we first need to set to the sans font and change the dialog to $, buy it for, and then a \n to create a line break, and our brackets which will show the current item's price, and at the end we want G with a question mark, unless you're using dollars, in which case that should go before, and in either case, we want a space before the question mark. Finally, we set the font to be the mono font. We want to reset our font to the sans font and draw text at 230, 210. There will be our money, and then either a $sign before it or a G after it. And then we want to draw at 280, 210 the length of our inventory out of the max, which is 8 unless you set it otherwise. Now, we want to check if we're not buying something, and if so, we want to go up and down based on the button we press, and make the menu squeak sound. Then, we want an else for when we're selecting yes or no to buy an item, which we can copy and paste and just change the first value we check to be 1. Then we need a for loop that will actually draw all the items we can buy and their prices. It should loop the length of the stock array and then draw all the values with a dash in between them like this. At the end of the items, we want to draw the word exit. If we're not buying something, draw the soul at the right position like this. We want to make sure that if we're on the exit button like this, that we reset our percent, and that if we press select, that we go to the select menu, set selected to 0, set the menu timer to 2, and our buy flavor to the default. Then we want to check that if it's not on exit and our menu timer is less than 0, and we're not buying something, that if we press select, we enter the buying menu and set our yes no selected to 0 and our menu timer to 1. And if we press cancel, that it does the same thing as selected as if we selected exit, but also sets the percent to 0. The reason we're setting our timer to 2 and not 1 is that at the end of the frame, we're going to be subtracting from the timer, which means if we set to 1, it will instantly be 0. But if we do 2, it will have 1 frame of being 1. Now for the actual code to buy things, we first want to check if we're buying things. First, we want to make a for loop that will draw our yes and no like this. Then we want to draw the soul in the right place. Now we want to check if we're on the yes button and selected it, and the menu timer is less than or equal to 0. If we have enough money in inventory space, then we can subtract the price from our money and add the item to the inventory and play the item buy sound from Undertale. We then want to set our flavor to thanks and our timer to 2. Otherwise, if we can't afford the item, we want to set the flavor to broke and timer to 2. If we have a full inventory, then set the flavor to full and timer to 2. If we are on the no button instead and press select, we want to set the buy flavor to looking and timer to do. If we're on either button and press X, we should do the same. And at the end of the code, we should subtract 1 from the menu timer. For the sell menu, we first want to check if the keeper will refuse to buy things. If so, we want to draw a box like this. Then we want to have a variable to hold our lines for easy reference. Then we want to have a for loop that will draw all the lines on the current dialog page we're on using the mono font. We also want to draw the star next to each new line. If we press select and our menu timer is good, and we aren't on the last page, we should go to the next page and set timer to 2. If we are on the last page, we should go back to the select menu and have selected be 1 and set our timer to 2, and page to 0 and a refuse count plus 1. And if we have dialog for being refused for the number of times we've been refused, we should set our refuse lines to be the new refuse lines. Make sure to have your menu timer plus after this, after the if statement, and we should be done with that. In the case you have keepers that can buy things, we need to add this next part, and just as a disclaimer that I wrote this selling code while very tired at my grandparents' house and didn't comment it and forgot what some of it does precisely, so please excuse if I don't explain something. It's also not 100% accurate to the Tem Shop selling system, but it is functional. Anyhow, in the create event, we first want to create an array called noSell, which is a list of all the items that we don't want the player to be able to sell, like this. It usually is a good idea to prohibit selling any key items unless you're supposed to sell it for money or something. Then we need an array called sellable that we will set up in a second that will automatically determine what items the player has that can be sold. We also need an array called link that will keep track of the index in our inventory where each of the sellable items is. We will also need a variable called color, which will be a string of the column in the submenu we're in, and we need X, which will be if we're on the exit button or not. We also want a boolean for if we're selling or not. And boolean just means true or false if you didn't know, and is often shortened to bool. To determine the contents of our sellable and link arrays, we need a for loop that will go through each item we have. If our noSell array doesn't contain our item, then we want to increase the size of the sellable array by 1 and set a variable called len to the length -1 and set sellable len to the item at I in my inventory. We then want to set the link array to the sellable array's length and set link at len to I. Now, back in the sell menu, we want to check if we are out of sellable items and aren't selling, and then draw a box like this. Then we want to draw all the lines for when we don't have any items, like this. If we press select, we want to go to the select menu with the timer at 2 and selected at 1. We also need to actually reapply the values. We want to sellable at the top of our menu code here to make it sure that it's always accurate, like we did in the create event by copy and pasting it. We need one more else, which will manage the code for when we're actually selling. First, we want to draw the same box as in the last two if statements, and then we want to set selling to true. We then need to draw our money in the color yellow with parentheses around it and just the text exit. Then to draw the text itself, we just need a for loop that will loop 4 times for the vertical height of the list of items we can sell. And then we need another for loop that will loop 2 times for the horizontal width of the list. We'll use I and J for these loops as is standard in coding. Then we will need a variable called K, which will be I plus J times 4, which I like to put in parentheses just to make clear that J and 4 get multiplied before we add I. Then we want to check if K is less than array length sellable, and if so, we want to add a variable called item ID, which is sellable k.id. Then, if our item ID exists within our buy prices, we want to set the variable price to struct get keeper.buyPrices item ID, and draw that price next to the item name like this. Then we want an else that will draw the item with a default selling price of 0. After that, we want to set a local variable hi to 3 and check if column equals right, and check if column equals right to set hi to the absolute value of 5 minus the array length sellable. Now we want another local variable, this time called x for exit squeak, which should be false. Then we want to check for down pressed once and selected equals hi, a good menu timer, which we want to, when true, cause x to be true, column to be left, and exit squeak to be true. Else, if we press up once and exit is true and menu timer is less than or equal to 0, we want to set x to false and selected to 4 and exit squeak to true. After that, we want to set cell to selected and old column to column, and then we want to have the main navigation, and then we want to have our main navigation code like this. Once we got that, and we want to check for select button pressed and not x is true, and menu timer is less than equal to 0, and array length sellable is greater than 0. Then we want to set a variable called c to 0. If column is right, we want to set c to 4. If we want to condense an if statement to just one line, we can do something like this, just in case you ever want to do that. Then we want to set local variable item ID to sellable selected plus c.id. If the item ID can be found in our prices, then we want to set local variable price to struct get keeper.buyPrices item ID, and then add the price to our money like so. Then item delete selected plus c and update list and play sounds and timer 1 and reset cell. Then we want to say if length of sellable is 0 to set our x to true. Then if we press select and x and menu timer, then set menu timer to select, timer to 2, selected to 1, x to false, and selling to false. Else, we're going to have a few while loops, which you can copy and paste on the screen here, which will just make sure that we're always on the right item. Then we want a local variable called column offset, which should be 0. If column is right, set it to 150. Then we want x sol h to be 0. And if x, set it to 80 minus selected times 20. If cell does not equal selected, or x squeak or old column does not equal column, and not x, then play the squeak. Finally, we need to draw this sol like this, and we're done with the cell menu. Now in the talk menu, we want to make a local variable called options, which would be the keeper's talk options. Then we want to draw the two boxes like we did in the buy menu. Then in the mono fonts, we got to draw the talk flavor, and then reset the font and draw our money and inventory space just as we did before. Then the navigation code should be like before, but this time use the length of options for the first if statement. Then we gotta go back to the creative and add all the code we need for adding new lines of dialogue. First, we want a variable called original chat, which should just be an empty array. Then we want all lines to be struct get names keeper.lines, and have a for loop that will loop through each line. We want to check if the line the loop is currently looking at is in the chat array, and if so, we want to resize the original chat array and set its index at I to the current line. We want another for loop that goes through the original chat lines, and if the current index equals 0, delete that index and subtract 1 from I. Then, after the loops, set new chat to variable clone original chat. This will be an array that holds any new talking options that we unlock. Now, back in our talk menu, we want a for loop that will go through each option. We then want a local variable called new text, which should be an empty string by default. Then, if chat I equals struct get keeper.lines original chat I, and is new I, and I is less than array length options, we want to set talk color to yellow and new text to, in parentheses, new with a space at the start, and else set color to white. Then we need to draw a text color at this position, options I plus new text with the text color. Then after the loop, we want to draw the exit button and so like this. To wrap up the talk menu, we want to say if selected equals array length options, that if we press select, that menu equals select and selected equals 2 and timer is 2. Else if we aren't on the exit button and press select and timer is good, set menu to talking and timer to 2, and else if we press cancel and timer is good, set everything to what we did for when exiting. Finally, add a menu timer minus minus at the end of the talk menu code. Now for our talking menu, we just want one box like this. Then we want to set local variable talk lines to chat selected. We then want a for loop that will cycle through all the lines on the current page. Just set the fonts and draw the lines in the text like we did before. Then after the loop, check if we press select with a good timer and we aren't on the last page, and if so, increase page and set timer to 2. Else, if all those other things aren't true, but we're on the last page, we want to set menu to talk and timer to 2 and page to 0, and talk count selected to plus equals 1. Then we want the local variable lines, which is just our lines and lines names, which is variable instance get names lines. Then we want to check if there exists a dialog with the name of our original dialog option, plus the number of times we've used that dialog option, and if so, set our selected option to that new dialog. Then we're going to do the same check for any of the yellow new dialog, which we can do by copy and pasting what we just wrote into an else if, and change orig chat to new chat and talk count to talk count new. Then we want an else if that will check for the original option with an underscore new after it, and talk count new selected is 1. And if so, set chat selected to the new option and add new to the new chat selected, and add 1 to the new count, and set the talk option to be the name of the new option with underscore name at the end. We need another else if that will check if there's a line that's called the name of the new chat plus the talk count plus 1,000. If so, set chat selected to struct to get lines new chat selected plus string talk count new selected plus 1,000, and add 1 to talk count new selected. Then in another else if, check if there's a new option for the options that were new before, so that we can chain adding underscore new at the end of option names to add infinite new options within our keeper structs as we demonstrated earlier in the video. Inside of the statement, set chat selected to struct get lines new chat selected plus underscore new, and add underscore new to new chat selected, and set the talk count new selected to -998, and is new selected to true, and the talk options of our 4 selected options to struct get lines new chat selected plus underscore name. Our final else if will check if there's an option that has the original's name with underscore fin at the end, and that the talk count is greater than 1. In it, say chat selected equals struct get lines orig chat selected plus underscore fin, and is new selected equals false. Now, at the very end, add a menu timer minus minus, and we're done with the talking menu. Now, before we add our last menu, we want to create a script called scr warp, which will let us warp to a room and specify coordinates and facing directions all in one line of code. The parameters are room, x, which should default to 0, same with y, facing, which should default to down, do fade, which default true, and seconds, which should default to 0.2. If the main car doesn't exist, then make them. If do fade, then create a fade object by making it a local variable called fade, and set each value as I show here. To actually add the increment variable to the fade object, go in its create and set the variables like I have them here. Then make sure in the step event to add an else if room equals target room to subtract the increment from the alpha, and do the opposite if alpha is less than 1. Then in the draw event, add an if alpha equals 1 and copy and paste the animation end events inside of it and delete the animation end event. Now make sure to replace the code here in object warp with the new scripts with the parameters target room, target X, target Y, and facing. Back in our shop object, the very last menu we need to add is the exit. In it, we just need to draw a box and have a for loop to draw our outro lines like we've been doing. Then we just need to check if we've pressed select and the exit timer is less than or equal to 0. And if so, we want to SCR warp to all of the exit values for the R keeper. Then add an exit timer minus at the end of the exit menu code. The final line of code we need for the shop is to add a room end event, and in it set mainCara.camMove to true. One more thing I want to show off before we wrap up this video is a debug system that I made. It's called Noel's Gamemaker Debug System v2.1.0, or NGM DBS 2.1 for short, which you can find in the description as a Google Drive link. Be sure to join my Discord to ensure you can always download the latest version. You should join it anyhow because we have a very welcoming and helpful community of currently about 550 members, where you can just chat or show off your Fangame or ask for help if you need it. Anyhow, to import the debug system, at the top of Gamemaker, click Tools, Import Local Package, and select the file. There are detailed instructions on how to use it and such in the create event of the debug object, but as a basic rundown, it's useful for selecting and moving objects with the mouse, and spawning and deleting objects, and easy room navigation. I definitely plan on improving and expanding its capabilities going forward, so keep an eye out for that. And with that, this tutorial has come to a close. It was most certainly the longest I've spent trying to get one out, and will probably be the longest one by far. The script is 44 and some pages long, which I usually don't even have a script, and the smaller bit that I have recorded already, as of time of writing this outro, is already 50 minutes. And as of recording this section is about 2.5 hours. I started programming this video at the start of the year, and now it's the last day of February. I've spent every minute that I could working to get this out, which unfortunately I wasn't alive at the time due to school and the fact that I got the flu for an entire week where I couldn't do anything due to being in physical pain and needing to rest. Sorry that it took so long to get out. I do hope it didn't seem like too much for everyone to follow. It was kind of like 3 tutorials all smashed into one, but the hope is that the ideas from each part of the video built off of each other in a way that helps tie of all the concepts, like using structs nicely together, in a way that made it easier to learn and understand. The next part will be the new dialogue system video, which will be called part 10.neo. Hopefully it won't be as long as a wait, but we'll see. I won't release the video unless I'm satisfied with all the features of the system, which may be a lot. However, programming takes a lot less time than scripting, and I hopefully should be able to get away with no scripts in that video, beyond the intro and outro like I usually do, unlike today's video, which I felt I needed it just for myself, which somehow ended up being 20,000 words on the dot. Anyhow, this video has gone on long enough. Thank you everyone for watching this far, and just that all. As you can tell, I put a lot of effort into these videos, and it can be a challenge to get them out at times. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and hype the video if you liked it. I do hope the video has been helpful. It covers a lot and was worth the wait in my opinion. Anyway, thanks again so much for watching, and have an absolutely fantastic day.